Picture this. You're standing in the great hall of a medieval castle, watching as a queen receives news that will change everything. The messenger's face is pale, his hands trembling as he delivers word that her most trusted advisor has just signed a treaty with her enemies. In that moment, you witness something that defined medieval queenship more than any crown or ceremony ever could. The cold realization that survival on the throne meant navigating a world where betrayal wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. Medieval queens faced deadly betrayals at every turn, and what you're about to discover will completely change how you understand the brutal realities of medieval power. These weren't just political disagreements or court gossip. These were calculated acts of treachery that could end in exile, imprisonment, or death. And the most shocking part, the betrayals often came from the people closest to them. Before we dive into these forgotten stories of survival and deception, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of medieval history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these medieval stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with the dangerous game of medieval politics. What makes medieval queenship so fascinating isn't the fairy tale version we see in movies. It's the stark reality that every medieval queen lived with a target on her back. They existed in a world where political alliances shifted like sand, where today's ally could become tomorrow's executioner, and where the very act of being queen made them both powerful and incredibly vulnerable. Let's start with understanding why medieval queens were such natural targets for betrayal. Unlike kings who derived their authority from birthright and military might, queens often ruled through marriage alliances, regencies, or inheritance claims that could be challenged. Their power was frequently seen as temporary, conditional, or illegitimate by those around them. This created a perfect storm for treachery. The medieval political system was built on personal relationships and feudal obligations that could be twisted, manipulated, or simply abandoned when convenient. A queen might wake up to discover that her brother had allied with her enemies, that her closest advisor had been feeding information to rival claimants, or that her own nobles were plotting to replace her with someone more malleable. Consider the case of Empress Matilda, who should have been England's first ruling queen in the 12th century. When her father Henry I died, she had been designated as his heir. But her cousin Stephen moved faster, seizing the throne while she was in France. What followed was nearly 2 decades of civil war known as the Anarchy. But here's what's truly shocking about Matilda's story. The betrayals didn't come from strangers or obvious enemies. They came from people who had sworn sacred oaths to support her claim. Her own uncle, King David of Scotland, initially supported her, but then switched sides when it became politically convenient. Noble families who had pledged their loyalty to her father suddenly discovered reasons why a woman couldn't rule. Even members of the church who had witnessed her father's designation of her as heir found theological justifications for supporting Stephen instead. Matilda's experience reveals the first crucial truth about medieval queenly betrayals. They were rarely spontaneous acts of passion or personal grudges. Instead, they were calculated political moves disguised as matters of principle. Her betrayers didn't simply wake up one day and decide to oppose her. They carefully constructed elaborate justifications that made their treachery seem righteous, even necessary. The psychological warfare that accompanied these betrayals was perhaps more devastating than the political consequences. Imagine being Matilda, knowing that men who had eaten at your father's table, who had sworn sacred oaths in church ceremonies, who had been trusted with the kingdom's most sensitive secrets, were now actively working to destroy you. The isolation must have been crushing. But Matilda's story also demonstrates the resilience that medieval queens had to develop to survive. Rather than accepting defeat, she fought back with a combination of military force and political maneuvering that would have impressed any king. She understood that in medieval politics, betrayal was not a deviation from the rules. It was part of the game, and successful queens had to master it. The most insidious betrayals often came wrapped in the language of protection and guidance. Medieval queens constantly had to navigate advisors who claimed to act in their best interests while secretly undermining their authority. These weren't obvious villains twirling mustaches in dark corners. They were respected nobles, learned clerics, and trusted counselors who spoke of duty and wisdom while plotting destruction. Take the case of Joan of Navarre, who became Queen of England through marriage to Henry IV. For years after Henry's death, she seemed to enjoy a comfortable widowhood, maintaining good relationships with her stepson Henry V and the royal court. Then suddenly, in 1419, she was arrested on charges of witchcraft and attempting to kill the king through sorcery. The accusations were absurd, but they weren't random. Joan controlled significant dower lands and had accumulated substantial wealth that the cash-strapped English crown desperately needed. Her arrest conveniently allowed Henry V to seize her properties under the pretense of protecting the realm from supernatural threats. But here's the truly chilling part. The charges were brought by people who had served in her household, who had accepted her patronage, who had sworn to protect her interests. Joan spent 3 years imprisoned, her reputation destroyed, her wealth confiscated. The betrayal wasn't just political, it was personal. Servants who had lived under her protection turned against her when offered incentives by the crown. Nobles who had courted her favor suddenly remembered suspicious incidents that could be reinterpreted as evidence of witchcraft. What makes Joan's case particularly revealing is how the betrayal was orchestrated. This wasn't a spontaneous accusation born of genuine fear or suspicion. Royal officials carefully cultivated witnesses, coached testimonies, and constructed a narrative that would justify their actions. They understood that successful betrayal required not just opportunity but also plausible justification that would satisfy public opinion and legal requirements. The witchcraft accusations against medieval queens reveal another disturbing pattern. When political betrayal needed popular support, queens were often portrayed as unnatural, manipulative, or dangerous to the natural order. Their intelligence became cunning, their influence became manipulation, their success became evidence of supernatural assistance. This transformation of queenly virtues into deadly flaws was a sophisticated form of character assassination that made betrayal seem not just acceptable but necessary. A queen's education could be reframed as dangerous learning that threatened Christian values. Her political acumen could become evidence of unwomanly ambition that violated divine order. Her survival instincts could be painted as ruthless cruelty that endangered the realm. Medieval chroniclers, who were almost exclusively male and often had their own political agendas, played crucial roles in these character assassinations. They crafted narratives that justified betrayals after the fact, creating historical records that painted treacherous nobles as reluctant heroes forced to act against dangerous queens. These accounts shaped not just contemporary opinion but historical memory for centuries to come. The speed with which these betrayals could unfold was perhaps their most terrifying aspect. Medieval communication systems meant that queens often learned of plots against them only when it was too late to respond effectively. A queen might go to bed secure in her position and wake up to discover that half her supporters had switched sides overnight. Eleanor of Aquitaine experienced this kind of lightning-fast betrayal during her marriage to Louis VII of France. As one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe, controlling vast territories in her own right, Eleanor initially seemed to have found the perfect political partnership. But when the marriage began to sour, she discovered just how quickly allies could become enemies. The annulment of Eleanor's marriage to Louis was officially granted on grounds of consanguinity. But the real reasons were far more complex and revealing. Eleanor had failed to produce a male heir. She had clashed with Louis over political decisions, and she had made powerful enemies at the French court who saw her influence as dangerous to their own ambitions. But here's what makes Eleanor's experience so instructive. The betrayal didn't just come from her husband's supporters, it came from within her own entourage. Nobles from her own territories began to question whether their loyalty should lie with her or with the French crown. Advisors who had once praised her political wisdom suddenly discovered that her actions were reckless and dangerous. Even more devastating was the way the betrayal was framed in moral terms. Eleanor's strong personality, her political ambitions, and her refusal to be a passive consort were reinterpreted as evidence of unwomanly behavior that threatened the natural order. Her intelligence became manipulation, her independence became rebellion, her success became proof of dangerous ambition. The aftermath of Eleanor's annulment reveals another crucial aspect of medieval queenly betrayals. They often triggered cascading effects that could destabilize entire regions. When Eleanor married Henry II of England just 8 weeks after her French annulment, she brought her vast Aquitaine territories into the English sphere of influence. This shift in the balance of power created conflicts that would plague Anglo-French relations for centuries. Medieval queens also faced a unique form of betrayal that kings rarely experienced. Their own children could become weapons used against them by political opponents. Queens who had devoted years to nurturing and educating their offspring sometimes found those same children turned against them by ambitious nobles or rival claimants who offered better prospects for advancement. The most heartbreaking aspect of these family betrayals was how they were orchestrated. Medieval queens understood that their children were political assets as much as personal treasures. They carefully arranged marriages, educations, and alliances designed to protect their offspring and strengthen their own positions. But these same arrangements could be turned against them by clever opponents who offered the children better deals or convinced them that their mother's rule was somehow illegitimate or dangerous. Isabella of France, known to history as the she-wolf of France, experienced this kind of family betrayal in its most devastating form. As Queen of England married to Edward II, Isabella initially tried to work within the system, supporting her husband despite his obvious preference for male favorites and his neglect of royal duties. But when the situation became untenable, she took the extraordinary step of leading a rebellion against her own husband. Isabella's rebellion succeeded, leading to Edward's deposition and eventual death, and her son Edward III's coronation with herself as regent. For several years, she wielded unprecedented power as the de facto ruler of England. But success made her vulnerable to new forms of betrayal, and the very nobles who had supported her rebellion began to plot against her regency. The betrayal that ultimately destroyed Isabella's power came from her own son. As Edward III reached maturity, ambitious nobles convinced him that his mother's continued influence was preventing him from becoming a true king. They carefully cultivated his resentment, portrayed Isabella's advisors as corrupt and dangerous, and finally convinced him to seize power in a palace coup that left his mother politically powerless. What makes Isabella's downfall so tragic is how the betrayal was framed as natural and necessary. The nobles who orchestrated her son's rebellion against her portrayed it as a young king rightfully claiming his inheritance from an overbearing mother. They transformed years of successful regency into evidence of dangerous female ambition that threatened proper masculine rule. The isolation that followed these betrayals was perhaps their cruelest aspect. Medieval queens who had once commanded vast networks of supporters, advisors, and allies found themselves suddenly alone, surrounded by people who had once sworn loyalty but now served new masters. The psychological impact of discovering that trusted confidants had been reporting their private conversations, that loyal servants had been cataloging their activities, That devoted friends had been waiting for the right moment to abandon them must have been devastating. Yet what emerges from these stories of betrayal is not just victimization but also remarkable resilience and adaptability. Medieval queens who survived learned to read political currents with extraordinary skill, to maintain multiple contingency plans, to never trust completely, and to always be prepared for the next betrayal. They developed networks of informants, cultivated relationships across political divides, and mastered the art of strategic retreat when necessary. The survival strategies that successful medieval queens developed were often as sophisticated as the betrayals they faced. They learned to compartmentalize information, sharing different pieces of sensitive intelligence with different advisors so that no single person could betray all their secrets. They cultivated relationships with multiple power centers, ensuring that the loss of one ally wouldn't leave them completely vulnerable. They mastered the art of strategic ambiguity, making statements that could be interpreted multiple ways depending on how political situations developed. Perhaps most importantly, they learned to use the very system that oppressed them to their own advantage. Medieval queens who thrived understood that the same networks of obligation, kinship, and mutual dependence that could be used to betray them could also be manipulated to create unshakable loyalties. They became masters of patronage, strategic marriages, and the careful distribution of rewards and punishments that kept potential betrayers invested in their success. The stories of these medieval queens and the deadly betrayals they faced reveal truths about power, loyalty, and survival that extend far beyond their historical moment. They show us how political systems create their own forms of vulnerability, how those who challenge established orders always face the risk of destruction by the very people they seek to lead, and how resilience in the face of betrayal requires not just strength but also cunning, patience, and an almost supernatural ability to read human nature. These queens lived in a world where trust was a luxury they couldn't afford, where every smile concealed potential treachery, where today's salvation could become tomorrow's destruction. Yet many of them not only survived but thrived, leaving legacies that shaped the medieval world and beyond. The brutal truth is that medieval queens lived in a world where power was always temporary. Trust was a luxury they couldn't afford, and their survival depended on navigating an endless maze of court politics where one wrong move could mean death. Their stories remind us that behind the crowns and castles lay women who fought desperately to protect themselves and their children in a system designed to use them as pawns. These queens faced betrayals not because they were weak, but because they dared to wield power in a world that saw female authority as a threat to be eliminated. Understanding their struggles gives us insight into the price of power and the courage it took to rule when everyone around you was plotting your downfall.